Hi there, my name is Duncan. I am an information designer based in Sweden and I am one half of Loud Numbers. I've always loved music. I spent my childhood listening to a lot of Queen, and then as a teenager I picked up the bass guitar and I played in a few bands, and then in my 20s I started running indie discos. I almost ended up working in the music industry, but instead I became a journalist, and over time that led me to data journalism and my work today as an information designer working with both text and numbers. But music has never left me. I've made a few visualizations over the years that are oriented around music, most notably my 2019 piece Time for Heroes, which tracks lines of influence in the indie music scene of the early 2000s. And so it was basically inevitable that I would eventually get interested in data sonification.
My name is Miriam. I'm a data journalist based in the UK, and I'm the other half of Loud Numbers. I played lots of instruments when I was growing up. I studied music at university. I flirted with music journalism for a while, and then I wrote my PhD in musicology at King's College London, while DJing a little bit of house and techno on the side. During my doctoral research, I became fascinated by how gathering data from recorded music could supplement the things your ears could hear, and so my interest in data and visualization was born. Since I left academia and started working as a data journalist, I've been keen to find ways to bring the worlds of data and music together. So one example is my project audification, which was made with Valentina De Filippo, and it visualizes musical data from David Bowie's song Space Oddity on a series of 10 engraved records. And like Duncan, it was only a matter of time before I got involved in sonification.
So over the last year or so, we've been working on Loud Numbers, which we think is the world's first data sonification podcast. Sonification, in case you're not familiar with the term, is the practice of turning data into sound. We wanted to go a step further though, and make not just sound, but music. Now, music has a special place in our culture. People have been telling stories with it for centuries, millennia even. It can excite us, energize us, uplift us, console us, and even scare us. Music has a direct line to our hearts as well as our heads. And it's a very, very powerful way to communicate. When our podcast is released later this year, you'll be able to hear us introduce 6 different stories, explain how we've turned them into music, and then hear the final tracks. And today, we're going to be giving you a world-exclusive preview of one of those episodes, which is a very exciting thing to say. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background of sonification. Now, there are lots of different ways you can map out the landscape of sonification. We particularly like a method that sonification researcher Thomas Herman developed in 2002, or at least he published a paper about it in 2002. He proposed 5 different categories of sonification, which we've simplified down to 3. The first is audification. That's when you get a bunch of data and you use time stretching and pitch shifting and compression to get it into a range that can be heard by the human ear. An example of this might be Sounds of the Sun, which was published in 2018 by NASA using data from its solar and heliospheric observatory. The data is sped up by a factor of 42,000 to bring it into a range that can be heard by the human ear. Now, the second type of sonification is what Herman calls earcons, or auditory icons. These are short little audio clips that represent events, just like a phone notification might, or the blips of a barcode scanner. In Herman's explanation, earcons are just abstract pings and bloops, while auditory icons sound like the thing that they represent. This can be a simple but really, really effective way to sonify data. There's a great bit of work by Tactical Technology Collective where they use the sound of buildings collapsing to sonify building collapses in Egypt. And then the final type of sonification is parameter mapping, which is what most data visualization folks think of when they hear the word sonification. This is where you map data values onto different audio properties like pitch, tempo, volume, duration, and so on. Just like data visualization maps data values onto color, size, shape, angle, and more. This is the approach that we've taken with loud numbers. And just like in visualization, some of those mappings are more effective than others at conveying information. So I'm going to pass you over to Miriam, who's going to talk a little bit about what we've learned from a year of work in sonification.
Firstly, we've learned that sound has real advantages over visuals for communicating certain kinds of data, especially time series data. Sound can only be experienced through time, so any data that also unfolds through time, whether population, GDP, or the number of collapsing houses, is a natural fit for sonification. As an example, here's a sonification of climate data by composer Chris Chafe. The pitch of the siren sound represents average global temperatures from the late 17th century to 2016. And the pitch of the plucked string sounds represent atmospheric CO2 concentrations over the same period. You can clearly hear the acceleration in temperature and CO2 rise in recent years as the pitch of both sounds rises faster and faster towards the end. But this sonification not only makes the changes over time audible, it also immerses you in a kind of dramatic narrative. With sonification, you have the power to control the pace at which a story unfolds. Sound is much harder to ignore than visual content. There's no real listening equivalent to skim reading an article or glancing to get a quick overview of a chart, and you can't look away, although you can of course turn it off or do something else while listening. Much of the dramatic effect with this example is down to the choice of sounds used. So when you hear a siren wailing higher and higher, it's really hard not to feel a sense of growing panic and urgency. Sonification is actually well suited to highly emotive data because sounds often evoke moods and have strong emotional connections. For example, a bell conjures up a completely different mood to an air horn. Some of the most powerful sonifications can be very simple, like the climate sonification we just played. But on the other hand, sonification is also well suited to complex or multi-dimensional data. Sound can vary in many different ways at once. You can map one thing to pitch, another to loudness, and another to instruments, for example. In one of our upcoming podcast episodes, we sonify the taste and aroma of 10 different beers. The audio characteristics of each instrumental line are determined by scores that were compiled by a beer expert on various taste and aroma dimensions from acidity to carbonation to hoppiness. There are a total of 10 different sound mappings. Taste is complex, so the sonification needs to be complex as a result. Here's one of those mappings. The amount of carbonation in a beer, that's its fizziness, is represented by the relative loudness of this sound. Over the last year, we've enjoyed exploring how to map different audio parameters to data. We've learned a lot more about which kinds of mappings work best and in which contexts. In particular, we have learned to look beyond pitch. Pitch is often used in data sonification to communicate quantity, where notes of a higher pitch signify more of something. More people, more money, more cars, more CO2. Pitch is the default mapping in two-tone, which is a really great free sonification app. Here's a sonification of one of their example datasets, the slightly weird Prussian cavalry killed by horse kicks between 1875 and 1894. The more cavalry killed each year, the higher the note. But as you listen to this, ask yourself if that mapping feels effective. I'm not sure it does. Mapping pitch to quantity does make sense on one level. In data visualization, higher typically means more, as in a bar chart or a line chart, and in music notation, notes of a higher pitch are written nearer the top of the stave. But this actually doesn't correspond to the physical origins of pitch. In the real world, it's the smaller drums and the shorter strings that make the higher sounds, and the larger drums and the longer strings that make the lower sounds. So pitch can be quite ambiguous. Fortunately, there are many other options. You can map quantity to loudness, so louder equals more, to number of instruments, more instruments playing equals more data, to EQ, so bass here equals more, to duration, longer sound equals more, to number of sounds in a time period, where more sounds equals more, to tempo, where faster equals more, and so on. Or you can even double or triple map data to more than one of these at once, for example pitch and loudness. So how do you know which audio parameters to use? Well, each one has unique qualities and also distinct limitations. For example, loudness can have a powerful effect, but it is affected by the playback system, especially the volume level and the bass response of the playback system. And it's also affected by audio engineering techniques like compression. Loudness is best used, we think, to communicate large differences and obvious trends. Instrumentation is great for communicating categories. You might decide that trumpets represent one category of data, violins a second, and drums a third, for example. And there are many occasions, where pitch is very useful. Our ears are generally good at detecting small pitch shifts. That's why out-of-tune singing sounds so bad, for example. So tiny pitch differences can effectively communicate tiny differences in underlying data values. Pitch can slide, like this. So it's great for data that varies continuously, like height across a population. It can also form discrete steps of a scale, like this. So it's also good for data that forms ordered categories, like income brackets or age groups. With loud numbers, our sonifications are also pieces of music, so we typically use traditional musical sounds, structures and genres. For example, one sonification we are working on represents the number of laws in the EU database as the number of voices in a classical piece, inspired by European classical music. Finally, we've learned that people are generally less used to hearing data than seeing it, so if you make a sonification, it's a good idea to clearly explain how you've mapped the data onto sound, using a text or audio or visual description. The rules on what works and what doesn't are still being written for sonification, which makes it a very exciting field to be involved in.
Okay, now you know how sonification works, and it's time to show you one of the pieces that we've been working on. We're going to do this a little bit like the podcast itself, telling the story, explaining the sonification system, and then we'll end our talk with the final sonification itself all together. This episode is called Boom and Bust. Let's roll.
The economy of the United States is the largest in the world. Every year, its population produces more than $20 trillion worth of goods and services. That number is what economists call gross domestic product, or GDP. Normally, GDP grows by a few percent each year, but every so often something happens that causes it to fall. A large geopolitical event, the collapse of a stock market bubble, or a global pandemic. These falls are called recessions, and they're generally bad news. Unemployment rises and stock markets plummet. We're told that money makes the world go round, that it doesn't grow on trees, and that it can't buy happiness. Today, though, we're asking, what does money sound like? So, Duncan, where did the idea for the story come from?
I think this was originally an idea of yours. In the notes for one of our earliest meetings about the project, you wrote the sound of the US economy over time and sampled drum loops. And that's exactly what we've got going on here.
Yes, I had this idea that financial data would work really well in music because it's normally reported in quarters, which gives it a natural 4/4 beat.
Yeah, we wanted to tell the story of the US economy since the late 60s. It's a roller coaster ride of booms and busts set against a background of dramatic changes in both the United States and in the wider world. There are oil shocks, there's dot-com collapses, there's Reaganomics, but overall, throughout all of that, the economy just keeps on growing.
There's also the dramatic rise of inequality over that time span. At the start of our data, that's in 1968, the poorest half of the population took home about 20% of national income, while the richest 1% laid claim to about a tenth. But today, those proportions are reversed.
Now, our track is based around a beat, but not just any beat. This is the Amen break, a legendary drum sample. It's so legendary that you'll recognize it in an instant. Here it is. Now that sample comes from a 1969 track called Amen Brother by the soul group The Winstons. Here it is in the context of the original song. The Amen break is the cornerstone of entire genres of music, from hip-hop to drum and bass, and it's the most sampled song in musical history. According to whosampled.com, it had been sampled in no fewer than 4,841 songs by the time that we'd recorded this talk.
So let's add 1 to that total. Our sonification speeds up the Amen break to 160 beats per minute to make a track that's heavily influenced by early 1990s UK jungle and rave music. Because the US economy is a party, but not everyone is invited.
But there's data in these drum loops. Our track maps the Amen break to the state of the US economy. When it plays forwards, the economy is growing.
But when the US economy starts cooling down and spinning backwards into recession, so does the music. And when the US economy moves out of recession, well, there's no better way to get a crowd going than this.
We also sonify the value of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which tracks the performance of 30 leading companies in the United States. It's mapped to a gentle, wispy synthesizer sound which rises in pitch as the Dow Jones rises.
We're also tracking inequality with a sample. There are a lot of vocal samples on this track, which generally help tell the story of the data around that time point, like Ronald Reagan talking about taxation in the 1980s, for example. But you're going to want to listen out for one sample in particular. It sounds like this. The volume of that sample represents the share of national income going to the richest 1%. Listen out for the volume of this sample throughout the track.
A bad man, in case you're not familiar with the term, is Jamaican street slang for somebody who's powerful, who commands respect, an elite, basically. It works on several levels. And then finally, US presidents are fond of making bombastic statements about the economy, especially in election years. So in years where there is a presidential election, you'll hear this fat bass line.
Since US elections happen every 4 years, the bass drops every 16 bars. I do love it when data naturally forms musical sounding patterns. Alright, that's it. You're ready to hear the whole thing. This is Boom and Bust.
It's the economy, stupid!
It will be essential for all of us to live and work in lower temperatures. We must ask everyone to lower the thermostat. The cuts must now go deeper.
All of us must learn to waste less energy. If we learn to live thriftily and remember the importance of helping our neighbors, then we can find ways to adjust.
This is unreal. Isn't this disgusting? Why doesn't anybody contact the president? Why is he letting this happen to us?
It is a crisis. It is a crisis.
Reaganomics fiscal disaster.
It is a crisis of confidence.
Reaganomics. 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 Reaganomics.
The power to tax is the power to destroy. The power to tax is the power to destroy. The power to destroy.
The 80s was a very special decade. The 80s was a very special decade.
What a bank has for sale.
The 80s was a very special decade.
What a bank has for sale is information.
Reviving the American dream by restoring the American economy.
Sure, I think we all dream. I think that's the fun part of life is being able to have a dream that hopefully someday will come true.
You want to be successful? You want to be like Trump?
Over a long period of time, there's very little risk in stocks. Owning a diversified group of companies, you're going to participate in the growth of America, the growth of America, the growth of America.
The growing power of the internet.
The information technology revolution. The money is flooding out of Wall Street like the dam has burst. There has been the most extraordinary amount of wealth creation. You've got to be perverse to say the market's going to crash.
So much of the financial sector has ended up just financing finance, insurance, and real estate, which conveniently the acronym is HIRE. The profits being earned are not actually being reinvested. HIRE. Back into production, back into the workforce, human capital and skill, research and development.
An extraordinary period for America's economy. We've seen triple-digit swings in the stock market. Major financial institutions have teetered on the edge of collapse, and some have failed. We're in the midst of a serious financial crisis.
Capitalism is the solution. Capitalism is the only solution that they have to their problems.
We can fundamentally change the system.
Yes, we can. The American people are hungry. Yes, we can.
The stories we are telling, first of all, they're just stories. The economy is a story.
You want to be successful? You want to be like Trump? You want to be like Trump?
America first. It's going to be only America first.
You want to be successful? You want to be like Trump? Gimme, gimme, gimme. Push, 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 push. Step, step, step. Crush, crush, crush. I know you're rich. I know you got $40 billion. But can you just keep it to one house? There's no way. There's no way that these people should own planes and their people don't have houses, apartments, shacks, drawers, pants. Even if you earned it, you still owe.
So that's the end of our talk. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow our work, you can visit our website at www.loudnumbers.net, where you can also sign up for our newsletter, where we share how we're building the podcast and some of the other amazing work being produced by other sonification folks from around the world. You'll also be the first to know when the podcast is released. You can also follow us on Twitter. We are at loudnumbers there. Finally, we would love to answer any questions that you have. Thank you so much.